Canada's National Museums. The 1996 report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples made a specific recommendation to Canada's museums. Museums and cultural institutions should adopt ethical guidelines governing all aspects of collection, disposition, display, and interpretation of artifacts related to Aboriginal culture and heritage, including the following: involving Aboriginal people in drafting, endorsing, and implementing the guidelines, creating inventories of relevant holdings, and making such inventories freely accessible to Aboriginal people, cataloging and designating appropriate use and display of relevant holdings, repatriating on request objects that are sacred or integral to the history and continuity of particular nations and communities, returning human remains to the family, community, or nation of origin on request, or consulting with Aboriginal advisors on appropriate disposition where remains cannot be associated with a particular nation, ensuring that Aboriginal people and communities have effective access to cultural education and training opportunities available through museums and cultural institutions. Recommendation 3.6.4. In the years following the Royal Commission's report, museums across the country have implemented many of its recommendations. Many have worked with communities to repatriate human remains or cultural artifacts. For some institutions, consultation and collaborative partnerships with Aboriginal communities have become standard practice, and Aboriginal internships and other training opportunities have been established. Yet, more is still needed, even as museums are faced with significant challenges in obtaining adequate and stable multi-year funding to properly support these critical initiatives. Over the past 3 decades, Canadian museums that used to tell the story of the nation's past with little regard for the histories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are slowly transforming. Although dialogue between museums and Aboriginal peoples has improved substantially since the 1980s, the broader debate continues over whose history is told and how it is interpreted. Here we focus on 2 national museums, the Canadian Museum of History, formerly the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. As national public history institutions, they bear a particular responsibility to retell the story of Canada's past so that it reflects not only diverse cultures, history, and experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, but also the collective violence and historical injustices they have suffered at the hands of the state. It is instructive to examine how these 2 public history institutions plan to interpret the history of Aboriginal peoples and address historical injustices in the coming years.